Hey, El, can you hear me? Looks like you're muted, so I can't hear you.
Right, can you hear me now?
I can. How are you?
Excellent. I'm well, and yourself?
I'm doing so good. Thank you
Good,
for asking.
good. Of
Um,
course.
I will just take, this will take all of 2 minutes. You can see right now it's kind of an introduction slide. Um, what I'll do is when we start at 1:30, I'll go through this. It's 7 slides, I think. I'll kind of read from a script and introduce you. Um, it has information about like CEUs for participants and how to stuff like that. So I'll do like that quick and I will switch over to your PowerPoint and then I will pass I don't know if you can see by my name, the FATA webinars, there's a little arrow right by my name. Um,
Yes.
so what I can do is I can drag that to you and you should be the presenter now.
Okay,
And
excellent.
there you go. So you'll go through your PowerPoint. I'm going to take that back from you for one moment. Once you're done with the PowerPoint, just let me know. I'll take it back. And then I do a conclusion PowerPoint. Very similar thing to what I do at the intro, really just telling people how to do the evaluation for your presentation and how
Mm-hmm.
to get their statement of completion and CEUs.
Okay.
Um, so it's pretty straightforward.
Yes, yes, it is. And the chat box, is that available to the participants?
Yes, it is. And what I'll do, I'll be here the whole time. I'll help you watch it. So, if you ask a question and you're able to look and see some of the answers, great. But if at some point somebody says, "Hey, I have a question for the presenter," and you're talking, I might say, "Hey, Al, there's a question in the chat here." Because I know sometimes it can be hard to balance notes and PowerPoint and chat all at the same time. So,
Yes.
um, I will be here in case anybody asks a question. If you haven't seen it, or if you're talking through something, I'll find a natural time to say, "Hey, Al, there's a question in the chat
Okay.
about X, Y, Z." You know,
Okay. All right.
um,
Excellent.
the only other thing I will tell you is the video. I have downloaded it. So we try and avoid ads coming up.
Mm,
So once you get to that slide and you're ready for the video, let me know and I'll show you what it looks like.
okay.
Um, it's gonna pull up and I'll play
Let's
through
start
it.
by learning an
You can
acronym
hear it
that we
correct,
use to
Yes.
describe
except
these
it's not showing an
very
image, is it?
concrete, engaging
Hold on one
systems.
second. It's
Force.
I see it, but it's not, I'm sorry, I
Yeah,
hear
it's
but
not
not
moving.
seeing
Okay.
it.
I'll fix that real quick. Um, but then once the video is played through, then I'll pass it back to PowerPoint and pass it back to you.
Okay.
So
Perfect.
that's really it. So I'm gonna mute and I'm gonna fix that while we're here
Okay.
and before we get to 1:30. So
Okay, excellent. And if you don't mind, I'll just hang out here since I'm already on.
yeah, yeah, that's
Okay.
fine. And if you need to step away for a minute, that's fine. Like I said, as long as once 1:30 starts, I'll go through something for a minute. So if you have to step away, feel free.
Okay.
Um,
Uh,
okay.
all right.
I'm
Thank you.
I'm gonna fix that and then I will test it out again. That is why we do test runs.
start by learning an
Okay, you can
acronym
see that
that
now,
we use
correct?
to describe these very concrete, engaging.
Sorry, yes, I can.
Perfect. So we're all set. So I mean, at 1:15, I will probably say a very quick thing, just letting participants know, like, hey, welcome to the PowerPoint or to today's presentation. And then again, 5 minutes before, and then right at 1:30, I'll jump into this introductory PowerPoint. Good morning, everyone. Happy Thursday to you all. Thank you for being here today for the Resilience presentation. We will begin on time right at 1:30. If you could just drop a note in the chat letting me know that you can indeed hear me. If you have any issues with audio at any point during today's presentation, we have added some connection instructions and other important information in the chat box. Thank you so much, and we will get started here very shortly. Good morning again, everyone. Thank you for joining us. Happy Thursday to you all. Hope you're all doing well. We're excited that you're here for the Resilience, Adolescents, and Marijuana Use presentation. We will get started on time here in about 5 minutes at 1:30. Good morning, everyone. My name is Robert Hersey. Happy Thursday to each of you, and on behalf of the Florida Alcohol and Drug Abuse Association, welcome to today's webinar entitled Resilience, Adolescents, and Marijuana Use. This webinar is being made available through a collaboration of the Florida Department of Children and Families and the Florida Alcohol and Drug Abuse Association. Please note that as an attendee, You are in listen only mode and are only able to view your name. Your webcam and microphone have been disabled. If you have questions, please send them to the presenter and myself, the host, FATA Webinars, by using the chat panel. The button to open the panel is usually located on the upper right side of your monitor. Please use the chat panel to send any questions you may have as you think of them. The presenter will address questions as time permits. Our audio is broadcast through the internet to your computer. If you experience poor computer at any time during today's presentation, there are a few options to try using the Communicate menu. One of these options is on the screen now, and all options are posted in the chat panel too. After ensuring your volume, both on your computer and external speakers if applicable, is not lowered, you may click the Communicate menu, then click the Audio Connection panel. Click Disconnect. Follow the first two steps again, click Call in using computer, and follow the instructions. If you continue to experience poor audio through your computer, try using the I will call in option under the Communicate menu. The access code and event password are on your screen and in the chat panel. You must be connected to the audio of this presentation and also view it on screen to receive a certificate of attendance. We are unable to verify attendance if you are not connected to WebEx via your computer or mobile device. Therefore, audio-only attendees will not be eligible for a certificate of attendance or CEUs. The recording and materials used in today's presentation will be available on the FATA website within 30 business days. To access the recording in PowerPoint, please visit www.fata.org, navigate to the Resource Center, and click on Training Library as shown on the screen. FATA produces many webinars and workshops through the support of the Florida Department of Children and Families. To help participants track credits earned through attendance, we host an online community that provides a personalized digital journal where participants can maintain statements of credit for webinars and workshops taken through the Florida Alcohol and Drug Abuse Association. At the end of today's webinar, the web browser will direct everyone to an evaluation form on the FATA website. You will first need to register or sign into your account to complete the evaluation. Information you provide FATA as part of registering remains confidential. Statements of credit will be posted within 30 business days after the evaluation closes in individual professional development journals for persons completing the evaluation and attending the entire webinar. Completing the evaluation is necessary to receive CE credits or to access your statement of completion. Please note that the evaluation will close at midnight on Wednesday, October 4th, 2023. Up to 2 continuing education credits are available for participating in today's webinar for persons licensed through the Board of Nursing, the Board of Clinical Social Work, Marriage and Family Therapy, Mental Health Counseling, and for persons credentialed through the Florida Certification Board. If you are a licensed healthcare practitioner, please be sure to include your Florida license number for reporting to CE Broker when you register with our site for the first time. If you are certified with the Florida Certification Board or licensed outside of the state of Florida, you do not need to provide your certification number when you register with our site. Please note that WebEx monitors arrival and departure of attendees and provides a report upon completion of the webinar. We are not permitted to provide a certificate of attendance if you do not attend the entire webinar, and we are not permitted to provide partial CE credit. We encourage you to complete the survey as soon as possible. If you experience technical difficulties accessing the survey, please fill out a contact form at www.fata.org or email training@floridabha.org before the evaluation closes. This presentation is intended solely for educational purposes. The views, opinions, information, and content expressed in the presentation are those of the presenter and do not necessarily reflect the views, opinions, or policies of the state of Florida, the Florida Department of Children and Families, the Florida Alcohol and Drug Abuse Association, or the Florida Behavioral Health Association. Attendees should note that sessions are recorded and published in various media. Our presenter today is Ms. Worsham L. Worsham L is a licensed clinical social worker, certified family trauma professional, and trauma sensitive yoga facilitator. With over 15 years of experience, she empowers vulnerable youth and families in various settings, including community, medical, academic, residential, and child welfare. Worsham L specializes in the treatment of complex trauma and the implementation of trauma informed care. L is passionate about educating professionals and caregivers on the impact of complex and historical trauma. She has trained over 2,500 professionals and was nominated as a top healthcare provider of 2017 by the International Association of Healthcare Professionals. Her bachelor's degree is in psychology from Loyola University, and she received her master's degree in clinical social work from the University of Chicago. Now, Ms. L, I will turn the presentation over to you.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Robert. All right. I'm really excited to be here with everyone. So I welcome all of you as we're rolling in. So before we get started, please and use the chat box if you're able and let me know what role you are, right? We might have parents on the line, we might have therapists on the line, we may have mentors. This will help to make sure that as we're discussing the content that's important for us to understand and building resilience in adolescence, I'm able to be mindful about connecting it to different roles that we have and different ways in which we'll interact with the adolescent. So we have, okay. So we have some social workers, licensed therapists, we have people in the juvenile justice system, mental health, let's see, drug specialists, counseling, okay, nursing, life coaching, drug court therapists, awesome sauce. So we are across different settings, so this is wonderful. And so we'll be talking about how do we build resilience in adolescents so that they are less likely to engage in marijuana use, and more importantly, less likely to find themselves addicted to marijuana or abusing marijuana. So let's go ahead and get started with our content because these 2 hours fly by pretty quickly. You did already hear who I am, but I do like to just let you all know about why I'm doing this work and how I came into this work, specifically why I'm so passionate about working with adolescents. Adolescents is my favorite group to work with because they are oftentimes the most challenging. And for adults, it can be intimidating, their demeanors and the way that they carry themselves like little people, little adults, but not yet adults, right? And demanding autonomy and respect. And so when I was an adolescent myself, three of my parents or three of my family members, two of my aunts and my grandmother were foster parents in the child welfare system of Illinois. And they oftentimes will work with different teens and adolescents. And what I found in talking with these adolescents was that they oftentimes had the hardest time finding any type of stability. And oftentimes most of their foster parents were very, very impatient with the different behaviors and presentations that showed up. And so I found myself wanting to make sure that I'm able to bridge that gap between adolescence and adulthood so that teens are able to find themselves feeling comfortable communicating and utilizing the social support that they can receive from adults, but also so that adults feel comfortable engaging adolescents as well as being able to respond to some of their challenging behavior. So let's go ahead and begin understanding what we're going to do here today during our webinar. First, we want to understand the impact of marijuana on youth. And so we'll look at definitions and the different trends in which youth are using marijuana nationally and globally, as well as there in Florida. We'll also learn what skills we want to target in order to prevent use and to build resilience in youth, right? So when we're thinking about the specific development of youth and adolescents, what are the areas that we want to do, the skills we want to build, right? And then last, we're going to learn some concrete strategies to engage and teach youth. Oftentimes our school-based theories are wonderful for the understanding of what we're doing, but they oftentimes fall short of how to interact and engage youth in. So we'll talk about some different ways to be creative in the way that we're working with the youth that we're engaging. And so I have mainly practiced as a therapist with adolescents, but I've also been a site coordinator for mentoring programs, as well as site directors for a transitional living program. And so kind of worked with youth across a number of different settings, as well as helping out in or working with them on an inpatient unit during the school as unit there. So we have some different settings that we'll kind of have some thought around as to how this relates to them, as well as how we can begin engaging parents, because as we'll learn later, the family and the relationships with parents are one of the biggest ways we can help build resilience. So let's look at the prevalence. How often are youth using? Actually, youth are more likely to use marijuana than any other illicit drug. And as they age, as they come from 12 to 18 or 17, we're thinking about, as they get older, we find that the use of marijuana begins to go up. So they begin to initiate use more often the older they get. And about 20 to 50% of those youth who use on a daily basis may become addicted to marijuana. According to a Future National survey from 2022, we saw that 30.7% of 12th graders reported use in the past year, while 16.3% reported use in those past 30 days. Additionally, we see that there are about 3.1 million youth that are using marijuana. And so while these numbers are pretty large, right, we find that there is oftentimes a myth that youth believe that they are using, or their peers are using, much more often than they're actually using. And so having this information as the adults who are working with the youth and engaging with the youth, we're able to begin helping to debunk some of those myths and kind of help our youth to begin thinking about the bigger picture around what are some things that have contributed to their understanding of youth, as well as giving them the true facts about most of their peers not having youth. As you saw on the previous slide, it's about 30%, right? And so that's a pretty large percent of youth who are not using, which is wonderful. And so we're going to talk about how do we make that number smaller so that we can continue to see a trend going down. Specifically in Florida, these are some numbers that we see there in Florida, where in the past 30 days, 12% of high schoolers and 3% of middle schoolers. So you see that this is smaller than the national numbers that we've seen in our previous slide. And over the lifetime, 22.9% of the high schoolers did report using marijuana, and 6.6% of the middle schoolers reported use of marijuana. Now, when we think about the use over a lifetime, this could be a one-time use, this could be daily use, and so it will range on how often they are using marijuana. But what is marijuana, right? We oftentimes believe that everyone knows what marijuana is, but we're going to break it down so that we're all on the same page. So marijuana are the dried leaves, flowers, and stems and seeds from a cannabis flower, sativa, or indica plant. And it contains over 400 chemicals, with the most potent and main chemical being THC. And so we're going to spend some time talking about THC, because THC is the reason why marijuana can become addictive. Additionally, the potency of THC is increasing over the last several decades. And by understanding how THC is impacting the brain development of adolescents, we are able to help them begin making better decisions and think thoughtfully around what the forms of cannabis they may find themselves using, as well as if they want to use, given the risks that they may have from use, especially if they're on the younger end of the spectrum. And we also see that the higher levels of THC increase the risk of psychosis and marijuana use disorder. And what we know about THC is that the not only do we see things increasing, we also know that some of the synthetic plants, such as K2 spice, have very, very high concentrations. So there are different types of marijuana that comes out. So we have the plant form, which is the most common form that we know of. But then we also have the seedless flowers from the unfertilized female plants, which has the highest part of the THC, and this is called sinsemilla. We also have hashish, which is a dried resin type substance, which is formed from compressing the cannabis flowers. So this is another potency that's even more than the typical cannabis flower. And then we also have the concentrates and extracts, which is extracted cannabinoids that are that are targeting the different brain areas in the brain, and that are really getting rid of all the plants that necessarily do not have all of the high effects. Can you talk about wax? So we won't go too deep into wax, but what I can let you know is that the wax and the concentrates that are being used are often sometimes called dab. They're used to and usually heated up and or may be used in a vape pen. And when they are using the concentrates and extracts, it's very difficult for us to know how much THC is in it oftentimes, which is why it kind of can increase the risk of not only psychosis, because if there's too much THC, the people are more likely to experience psychosis, but we also see that there is the increase in the risk for overdose. Although overdose with cannabis or THC is not often fatal, but can begin to happen when those THC concentrates or THC levels get higher and higher and higher. So those concentrates may also be called shatter, crystalline, crumble, distillate, sift, and dabs are the most common name right now. And then we have flower, which is oftentimes called over century decades here, ganja, pot, weed. We have dope, most recently is a newer name, loud. You can all read, so I'm not going to read directly off the slide here, and hopefully everyone's able to see. But these different names that are out there are helpful for us, so that when the youth are talking, maybe if we're working in schools or if we're working within centers or we're interviewing them or we're parents engaging with youth or we're listening to the music that the youth are listening to, etc., we're able to hear what it is that's being promoted within the media or being discussed amongst their peers, right? And so this is why understanding the different names that the marijuana may be called can be helpful for us, and being the adults that are going to help prevent youth from utilizing marijuana. THC impacts the cannabinoid receptors, and the reason why this is very, very significant, especially for adolescent use, is because it's targeting different brain areas. So these cannabinoid receptors are in different brain areas that are very, very sensitive and vulnerable during adolescence, because the brain is having a very rapid growth during this time frame. Adolescents are working on being able to regulate their emotions, recognize their emotions, delay gratification, right? Oftentimes manage those moods and things of that nature that kind of influence internally and externally. And so learning, memory, appetite, pleasure, reproduction, sleep, coordination, all of these areas are impacted because there are cannabinoid receptors that lie at each one of these receptors. And so THC mimics the natural cannabinoid receptors that are naturally in our brain. So our brain is not able to discern that this is THC, and it attaches, and the brain begins to process it as though it's a cannabinoid receptor that naturally resides inside of our brains. So THC, as I mentioned earlier, can cause psychoactive or does cause psychoactive reactions. This is the reason why people receive what is called a high, and the potency has risen over the last decades to about 14%, right? Whereas in the 90s, it was about 3 to 4%. So as you can see, that's a pretty large jump there in the last 3 decades that we've seen the THC levels rise. And when we think about the increase in youth using the concentrates, the edibles, and things of that nature, we find ourselves wanting to be mindful about the use of adolescents, the marijuana use within adolescents, because of the THC levels being so high, which makes them more vulnerable for addiction and the psychosis and some other long-term effects that we'll look at in just a moment. With the THC levels going up, it also makes it very important that we're giving the youth the information or psychoeducation that they need to make informed decisions and to be able to understand the potential risks that are involved in their decisions to use if they find themselves doing so. Now, that Spice K2 is a synthetic version that is designed to mimic THC, and it has chemicals, many chemicals in it as well, and up to 200% potency. There were a lot of overdoses, psychosis, and things associated with Spice and K2 when it hit the market. And this is oftentimes, unfortunately, sold at like gas stations and a little bit more readily accessible to youth. And so there are a number of different physiological reactions that has, but there has also been caught to seem to cause the psychosis and overdoses as well, because of the number of chemicals mimicking the THC. So marijuana can be used in a number of different ways. So it can be smoked oftentimes through a hand rolled cigarette or on a bong or a device that's oftentimes made out of glass. It may be inhaled. Right now, inhaling has become pretty popular amongst youth, where they are using vape pens. So there are little cartridges that they're used to inhale the marijuana without a trace. There's also the dab that's being used with heating in a little device. There's oral ingestion that may happen, which is also becoming very, very popular and is oftentimes targeting youth because they are being marketed as candy or baked goods or things that are appealing to youth. They can also be used or put into tablet forms as well. Now, the inhalation and the smoke is the most common types of use. The inhalation and oral ingestion, we find, or inhale, also kind of goes pretty quickly as well. Oral ingestion can take up to 4 hours, anywhere from 30 minutes to 4 hours before the person feels the effects. And so sometimes youth may find themselves using a lot more because they don't immediately feel the high as they would inhaling it or smoking it, because of the way that the lungs carries it directly into the bloodstream. Now, with oral ingestion, it's also important to know that if we do hear that our youth has some type of oral ingestion through a baked good or anything of that nature, we want to ask good questions around how much they've used and whether or not there's a wrapper, or if they know how much THC was included in that, because that's going to be important information to understand, as well as also knowing how long those effects may last. And we'll talk a little bit more about what some of those effects are in just a moment. The other way that it can be used is transdermally, and this oftentimes is used like in lotion or like through other ways that can be applied topically onto the skin. However, when we use it in a transdermally way, we see that it's not shown to have any intoxication or impairment, right? And so again, if it is put into a way in which we're applying it topically, there is not seen, research doesn't show any specific effects that it does when we're seeing youth use it through oral inhalation or smoking. Paraphernalia, another piece that we want to be mindful of and thoughtful around, especially as it begins to morph in this day and age. Roach clips are metal clips that can be used to hold a marijuana cigarette that has been smoked down and could burn the fingers if held by the hand. Electronic cigarettes are oftentimes which are used to smoke those extracts, or like the concentrations or dabs. So those little vape pens can be used, or our electronic cigarettes. And then you have grinder tools. So oftentimes they're little circular things that are twisted with little teeth in there that help to break the marijuana down into smaller pieces so that it can be smoked. So when marijuana are using, how do we know that perhaps they might be under the influence of marijuana, right? So if you're engaging with the youth on a regular basis, then you have the ability to recognize what's usual and unusual behavior for that youth. So if you find that they're having some unusual behavior outside of their usual and their typical way of being, that may be an indicator that they're under the influence. If you do not know this youth very well, some of the unusual behavior may be like, having a little bit more bizarre behavior that would be outside of our expectations for adolescents, right? We also have coordination issues, again, because of the way in which THC impacts the different parts of the brain that impacts coordination. They may be kind of leaning over, falling over, having trouble with their balance, etc. They may also have some uncharacteristic forgetfulness, again, because of the learning and memory being impacted by the THC and chemicals within the big marijuana. And then we have bloodshot eyes, or frequent use of eye drops to kind of keep their eyes from being red, having strange smells in their room or their clothing. The smells can vary because of not only the type of the marijuana that's being used, when the potency of the THC, but also what type of cigar or tool is being used in order to ingest it. Then we have frequent use of deodorizers such as incense or air freshener, Febreze, and things of that nature. And so these are just some potential signs that a youth is utilizing marijuana, right? Some other ways that we might see this begin to manifest is through drug-themed clothing, jewelry, or decor, right? So like, do they have t-shirts that have, and socks that have marijuana flowers on them? Do we see them having jewelry or earrings or pillows and blankets that have marijuana themed clothing, right? So these are some of the indicators that they might be interested in and more likely to use, or that their peers are using, or that they think that is cool, right? Unexplained lack of money or frequent requests for money is another potential sign of use, because of the way in which the marijuana impacts the part of our dopamine, more specifically, which is the chemical in our brain that tells us, do it again, that was great, do it again, that was great, which is why youth are so vulnerable to addiction, because they are very susceptible to immediate gratification and things that are bringing adrenaline rushes and things of that nature. And so when they experience this high, this and the THC levels, especially when they're smoking THC at a higher potency, there's more flooding their brain and there's more dopamine firing off, which means that there's a stronger urge to want to use it again. And so another sign of use is that there's a presence of paraphernalia, which is anything that has been modified for the making, using, or concealing of a controlled substance, right? And so there may be like a bong that's already created and manufactured within a factory, but youth have also been found to make bongs out of apples, out of aluminum foil, and other things that they found around the house. And so if you see something that looks a little peculiar, it's worth asking the youth what it is for and what's going on with their peers and different questions in that nature. The effects of use. So what happens when the youth are using? We understand what marijuana is. We understand why it causes vulnerability within youth and impacting of their brain development. We understand what are some of the signs that a youth is using. Now we want to look at what are the effects of use, right? So when we are seeing them having some more of those long-term pieces of use, what are we seeing? We're seeing that there's a frequency of use is much more of a better indicator than the duration of use, right? So how often are they using is going to tell you more than how long they've been using. Again, thinking about the potency of THC and how often that is firing and activating those dopamine receptors in different parts of the brain that are related to pleasure, which is, again, a very, very significant piece around adolescence, right? We all can probably remember our adolescent days and a lot of the silly things we've done in the name of finding and experiencing some type of fun, adventure, etc. So then we have our increased heart rates, right? Altered sense of time. So maybe they're like supposed to be home at 10 p.m. They get home at 12 and like, oh, well, mom, I just didn't know what time it was, right? Or maybe not really being able to give a story in the straight line. They may have slow reaction time. So perhaps you ask a question of them and it takes a moment for them to even realize or process that there was a question asked, right? Or maybe that there was a slow ability to move out of the way, right, when something's coming at them. There may be issues with balance and coordination that we talked about earlier, in addition to impaired driving. Right, so naturally, if reaction time is impaired, driving may also be impaired, in addition to an increase in appetite we see, where we might find that they're eating a lot more, maybe they're eating a lot of sweets. I think this is oftentimes called munchies. You have the difficulty with thinking and problem solving. So again, when we think about how THC is impacting the areas of the brain that is related to learning and memory, etc. This is going to impact thinking or cognition and problem solving. And so what is occurring with why this is so significant for adolescents especially is because thinking and problem solving is a large part of adolescence where they're beginning to really have some development of that prefrontal cortex, and where the other parts of the brains that have previously been developed are beginning to talk with that front part of the prefrontal cortex, especially emotional parts of the brain, where we all can remember our time in adolescence as well as maybe interacting with adolescents. There are lots of moods, lots of emotions, right, that are happening. Adolescence is almost like a second toddlerhood that is happening. Where because the marijuana is impacting these different areas in the brain, we may see some challenges with thinking and problem solving as well as memory impairment, right? So are they forgetting their homework? Are they forgetting the important tasks that they're supposed to do, extracurriculars they're supposed to be at, etc.? Other additional effects of use might be lung and breathing problems, especially if the youth is using through inhalation or smoking. Stroke can happen because of the activation of the sympathetic branch with an increase in the heart rate. And if the THC levels are higher, if they're using more, especially when we're thinking about edibles and concentrates where it's harder to understand that THC level, we can see that to be more likely. We have poor academic performance because of the impact on executive functioning, the impact on learning, the impact on memory, right? So it makes it difficult to show up, be present with the content. Truancy, where we might see that the youth are beginning to show up to school less and less often. Oftentimes when youth are abusing or using drugs, sometimes they skip out on school and find themselves with groups of peers who are using and getting high or doing other risky behavior as opposed to being in school. There's also an increase for risk for social anxiety, suicidal ideation, attempts and completion, in addition to some severe nausea and vomiting. which is called the cannabinoid hyperemesis syndrome, right? And so these are some of the more longer term effects that have been found for the use of marijuana. And remembering that when adolescents are using, the younger they use, the more likely they are to, if the frequency is high, they are more likely to find themselves at risk for developing a substance use disorder, as well as some other challenges with life satisfaction, some challenges with interactions with youth, relationships, and things of that nature. So let's look more deeply at the impacts of use, right? So we already talked about the attention, concentration, problem solving, and memory. And we understand that that is because the THC receptors, THC is impacting those different parts of the brain. And for adolescents specifically, their brain is actually developing in these areas at that time. So the poor performance at school and work, right? So they may begin to venture out and get some of their first jobs. And with school, some of the same reasons why they are experiencing problems with attention, concentration, problem solving, and memory that naturally transitions and moves into their ability to function at work and at school, right? We talked about poor balance in communication, judgment and decision making. Also, some prefrontal or executive functioning areas of the brain are also impacted due to those receptors being impacted there in the prefrontal cortex, as well as an increased risk for dropping out of high school. There's also less satisfaction with life later on, more additional problems in relationships. And so you may find that youth may be referred to you or come into your office because they're having increasing conflict with their parents, right? Or increased conflict with peers at school. There's an increased risk for mental health challenges as well, specifically depression and psychosis, especially for youth who began at a younger ages and those who are using on a daily basis. And that leads into the potential of developing cannabis use disorder that we'll look at, and we'll look at that criteria later on in our presentation. Additionally, a very significant piece that we want to be mindful of is that suicidal ideation, attempts, and completion are likely to increase with the earlier use and the more frequent use of marijuana, especially when there is when there is a substance use disorder that is being met. So let's look at what paraphernalia is and what it might look like as it relates to cannabis or marijuana. There may be rolling paper, which is a specialty paper that's used for making a marijuana cigarette. You might have a cigar. The cigar is typically hollowed out and then filled with the marijuana following use of a grinder. We have pipes, which is a device that is used to smoke marijuana, as well as bongs, similarly a device used to smoke marijuana as well. So these are some potential marijuana paraphernalia that may be present or show up within the household, or that parents may describe to you for those of us who are clinicians or those of us working in schools as well. Let me make sure. Do we have any parents in the room? Anyone here as a parent or community member? I think the titles were rolling in pretty quickly, and I mainly saw those in professional roles. I just want to make sure if there are any parents here, I'm not leaving you all out in that process. I'm not seeing any. Okay, so adolescents use prevention, right? We want to address those developmental needs that are associated with youth and are also associated with adolescent development, right? And so when we think about healthy youth development, we want to think about emotional skills, right? Social skills, refusal skills, and skills that are going to help to, and things and strategies that are going to help to build their self-esteem and their self-efficacy. The difference between self-esteem and self-efficacy. Self-efficacy is the use perception of how well they can do something or their ability and capability to do something, whereas self-esteem is how they view themselves, the image that they have of themselves. And these different prevention strategies that we're going to take a moment to look at are most effective when they are matched with the populations that have levels of risk. And we do that matching through a process of needs assessment. So there is going to be a resource later on that you all can use to kind of help with that process of determining what is going to be the best prevention method or program to utilize for your organization or your program or the youth that you're working with. So there are 3 different categories of prevention strategies. The first is universal, which is basically like a big umbrella where we're looking at just reducing the risk factors and maybe promoting the risk factors that are associated with adolescent use or use in general. And so for us, we're going to look at what are some of those risk and protective factors, so that as we're working with youth, we are also being very creative and intentional about making sure we are contributing to promotion of the protective factors, so that we can increase the ability for adolescents to have resilience in spite of use, or have resilience amongst those with peers who are using. The selective category of interventions or prevention strategies are targeting specific risk factors that are typically biological, psychological, or social risk factors. And these are risk factors that are associated with particular groups of adolescents that have higher risk for using, right? So this might be those who are having trouble, like in the child welfare system, or those who are involved in the criminal justice system, or those who are experiencing conflict and things like that at home. So we're going to look at what are some of those additional risk factors that might be used to help target some of those things. Low self-esteem, etc. Then we have the indicated. Now, this targets individuals who are already involved in risky behaviors, right? And so this is typically utilized in like treatment programs or with people who have already been seen to be used, whereas the previous two may target someone who is at risk or who is actually using, right? With the selective. So I hope this makes sense of three different categories that and types of programs that can be used in order to prevent the initiation of use of marijuana with adolescents, or to help to mitigate the ongoing use of marijuana if they've already experienced it. There are typically two different strategies that are used within those categories of prevention. One is called the community level focus, which is when we're looking at a population segment. It might be the country, the state, a county, or a city that are at risk, right? Whereas we also have the environmental strategies, which are looking at the direct impact, on social norms, attitudes, systems, and conditions that may influence or reduce the use, right? So more specifically, this might look like laws and policies that are targeted towards different things. And so for marijuana, what they found is that targeting the packaging and the marketing, and having laws and things around the purchase of marijuana, especially with dispensaries opening up, right, is starting to help mitigate some of the challenges that we're experiencing in 2023. And so when we think about the strategies, we want to make sure that there's a coordination and reinforcement. So ideally, there's a combination of community environmental levels that are being utilized within one of those three categories that were mentioned in the previous slide. So let's look at teenagers and what are the use factors, risk and protective factors, right? So that when we see the risk factors, we are able to recognize them for what they are, but more importantly, how we can increase those protective factors, and so that the protective factors can mediate against the risk factors that are present. And so we are going to use a socioecological model in order to look at the use factors that are impacting teenagers. And the reason why is because humans, right? This model looks at the fact that humans have an influence at multiple levels. It's a complex interaction that influences individuals. It's not just the individual itself. And so we have the individual, and we're grouping the individual and peer level together. We have the relational and family system, the community in school, as well as the community as far as the larger community as it relates to like the policy and norms versus the neighborhood type, right? Let me just come over to the box really quickly before we go on to looking at these different levels and the different risk and protective factors. Rachel asks, what do you do when a parent is encouraging their child to use? Parent lives out of state. Well, what we'll soon see on these previous slides is that a parent's attitude about use and their current use, or the use themselves, does have an impact on the likelihood of a youth using. And so one of the things that we would want to do then is to just help give the youth additional information about the use, the risk, and what happens when their brain is using drugs. So there are like really cool little videos about what the brain looks like on drugs, specifically marijuana and whatever other drugs they're using. If you're able to interact with the parent, you may even be able to offer that same information to the parent about how starting use earlier in life or through adolescence increases the possibility of the youth becoming addicted to drugs, and then what those long-term outcomes are as far as lower life satisfaction, troubles with relationships, issues with work, etc. The videos, do I have those videos? No, but I will make sure that I get those so that they can be shared with the other handout resource that we'll be sharing later on. And what if a parent uses medical marijuana? Well, there's one thing that we can do with the parents then is, or the youth at that point, is kind of helping them discern the difference between the medical versus the recreational use, right? And most oftentimes the medical marijuana has lower levels of THC and higher levels of CBD, which is the non-psychoactive ingredient in marijuana that is that is more associated with those medicinal effects, whereas the recreational drugs are oftentimes not only unregulated but are also higher levels of THC, which impacts their ability or increases their likelihood of addiction, of depression, of psychosis, suicide, etc. Okay, perfect. So we'll make sure we have those links in here when we post the video. Awesome. Great question. All right. So if it's all right with everyone, I'll continue on and we can take a peek at what are the protective and risk factors at each one of these levels, right? And so at the individual/peer level, the protector factors is that child's self-efficacy and saying no, right? Do they feel comfortable telling their peer no, or will they feel like they're being a lame or they're being square, right? Do they have future college aspirations? If there's long-term goals and things of that nature, then they are more likely to feel and think more concretely and constructively around the impact of their decisions now on their aspirations in the future. If their peers disapprove of use, they're also more likely to not want to use, right? Understanding that in adolescence, especially given that our social development is a very, very significant component of development in adolescence, the impact of the peers, either approving or disapproving, does have an influence on whether or not a youth is going to initiate use or find themselves using on a regular basis. Additionally, involvement in sports or physical activities also increase the possibility that youth will deter from utilizing marijuana. Why? It does so for a number of reasons. One, it contributes to youth's sense of belonging, their identity and self-esteem, which is something we've seen in the literature to help protect youth against the use of marijuana when they have a strong sense of self, right? And then a sense of belonging, right, is also another piece that's found to create resilience within individuals and teens. And so when they have a sense of belonging, like they're an important part of their team or their activities, right? We see that also has an impact on their self-esteem and their self-efficacy and not wanting to let others down, and the impact and that domino effect. Additionally, it helps out with coping and stress management, which we also see as another protective or risk factor. The youth's ability to tolerate distress and manage distress is also impacting. So when we're involved in physical activities and sports, we are also seeing that the more wellness components and benefits of engaging in those activities are helping to mitigate some of that as well. And additionally to those different rules and regulations that go into involvement within sports and physical activities, where there are sometimes different drops that are happening, or if they do get caught using, then they might get kicked off the team, etc. Right? So those are a number of different components that interact with one another to kind of influence youth involvement in use. Okay. Whereas the risk factors, right? So these are the things that are like the more we have, the more likely the use is to occur, right? So antisocial behavior, this antisocial behavior, like not wanting to be around people, being rude to people, bullying, doing basically any behavior that is socially unacceptable, may have an increase in risk factors because it impacts their sense of identity, it impacts their sense of belonging, right? And so the resilience factors are a little bit reduced there. High sensation seeking is also another risk factor. And so like if we see that a child or a youth really, really enjoys adrenaline rushes and things of that nature, then we see that there's an increase in the risk factor because of how dopamine and those highs can be fulfilling to that sensation seeking. And so when we think about these risk factors, right, the presence of these risk factors alone do not indicate that a youth will use, right? This means that it's possible and that the combination of these may increase the use. It also means that when we're seeing these things, we can help the youth to either get the skills in order to ameliorate the challenge, like for instance with antisocial behavior, help them learn some better social skills, communication skills, etc., or to help sublimate their behavior, or essentially create a healthy way in order to get their needs met, right? The sensation seeking, for instance. Another risk factor is aggression. If they're being aggressive to others, there's a likelihood of some substance use going on. This may be explained by the inability to kind of regulate, and like the rush and the flooding of the sympathetic system that is being activated kind of causing the aggression in the first place. And so sometimes use can help to ameliorate those or make it more tolerable for youth. And then we have the use of marijuana can lead to other substances. Now, what they have found is that marijuana use is the most common drug that is used, and people who have used other drugs, youth who have used other drugs, have oftentimes more than likely also used marijuana. However, there is not any research that is saying that there's a strong correlation of marijuana use being a gateway drug, right? So that's one of those myths that the research has not been able to impact. But there is a correlation between marijuana being one of those first drugs that are being used, and marijuana being a drug that a child has used, especially if they're using things like ecstasy, stimulants, and things of that other types of drugs. So we also have as a risk factor on an individual and peer level the use of other substances, right? So when we have a poly use essentially happening where they're using multiple substances at once, there's a higher risk of using marijuana. Additionally, that perceptions of peer marijuana use is a risk factor. I mentioned earlier when we were talking about the prevalence, youth often overestimate how many of their youth are actually using marijuana. And we saw the numbers were about 30%, and in Florida, it was even lower than that, like half of that, right? And so helping youth to understand and debunk those myths around how often youth are using is going to be helpful and important, especially when we think about how important the relationships are in our social peers acceptance is, right? Low perceived harm of marijuana use is another reason why youth may sometimes use if they don't think that they can't overdose, or they can't become addicted, or there's not going to be any negative consequences, right? We just went through all of the effects, or not all, but many of the effects and consequences that are correlated with substance use, specifically marijuana use. And so these are things and information that we want to give to the youth and their parents so that they are able to understand that there are harms that can happen with marijuana use, especially when you're starting to use marijuana at a young age and your brain is still developing. It makes them very, very vulnerable. And then lastly, here in this individual peer piece is their genetics, their individual genetics. And what we understand about epigenetics is that certain internal and external stimuli can trigger the desire to use, or that vulnerability or susceptibility to use and abuse of drugs. So when we come at the next layer of their family, right? The family is very, very, very important for youth. Peers are very important, but the family is also extremely important. And most often, many of those selected and indicated programs target the family or the school levels. Okay, so let's look at the protective families of the protective factors within the family system. The parent is seen as a role model. So being able to assess with the youth whether or not they have a good relationship with their peers. So for instance, when working in a outpatient substance use program, I would get a lot of referrals. Majority of our referrals were from schools, right? Where the children were caught either coming to school high, or kind of like caught at a party or something to that effect high. And so they were mandated to come in for treatment. And one of the questions that I would always ask is, describe your relationship with your parents, right? So understanding if there's like a one word, if they're a little apprehensive in answering, if they're kind of evasive around answering, right? That kind of helped to indicate that there might be some conflict, where we see that poor parent-youth relationship on the opposite end is a risk factor. Maternal affection, specifically affection from the mother, not negating the importance of fathers here at all, but unfortunately the literature did focus on mommies. And the maternal affection, right, having connection to their parents, their mother, showing love, showing affection, that can look a number of different ways, right? Remembering that culturally, affection may not be done in a physical manner. There are other ways that affection can be shown. So helping to understand how the child receives affection and sees the affection can be important. Another piece here is understanding the child's perception is just as important as the actuality of what's happening, right? So for instance, you may sit with mom or parents who are saying one thing about the relationship or one thing about how they love on their child. It doesn't necessarily mean that that's what the child's or the youth's perspective is. And so when we're engaging with youth, especially throughout of assessment, because a lot of us are providing treatments, and I'm imagining also doing assessments, it's important that we are really exploring the relationships with parents, the relationships with their mothers, right? And the perceptions of these relationships, most importantly. Additionally, high parental monitoring is also seen to be a protective factor. So are the parents asking their youth where they are at the end of the day after school, right? Do the parents know where their youth are going, who their peers are? Are they looking through their phones? How are the parents monitoring and guiding the interactions and the day-to-day activities of the youth? If the parents are pretty good at monitoring, like maybe they have their location and things of that nature, they're less likely to use because of the strong disapproval that may come from their parent, or the consequences of finding out that their parents are using. Family use, restricting marijuana use is also found to be a protective factor. So if the parent has a strong negative attitude toward or explicit rules stating that there is no use, then they are less likely to use as well. Again, remembering that even though adolescents act nonchalant and pretend like they don't care about their parents' perceptions and things of that nature, they really care a lot about how their parents perceive them, pleasing their parents, right? This is like a second toddlerhood, but now their bodies are just way bigger. They have a lot more language going on. They have a better grip on those emotions, but they're actually learning a little bit more on how to navigate those emotions and how to navigate communication and how to navigate relationships. Okay, so I'm gonna stop really quickly and see what our question, there's a question that pop up. So there's a question about marijuana overdose. I have not seen any marijuana overdoses that are leading to death, right? And so more often than not, when there is a marijuana overdose, it is due to an edible or one of those higher concentrates of THC, but they are suddenly fatal. I do not know any numbers, so you would have to do some research around that. I don't want to tell you a story. It's a great question. Okay, so I'll continue on here through these protective factors. Perceived parental trust, right? So again, with the idea of having a good relationship and caring how their parents see and view them, if they perceive that their parent trusts them, they do not want to ruin that trust, right? And so in that process, they may not want to use marijuana or any drugs for that matter if it's going to impact the trust that they have for their parents or from their parents. Whereas on the flip side with the risk factors, many of this is kind of like an inverse parental acceptance of substance use. So someone asks a question about, well, what happens when the parent is advocating for it, right? That is a risk factor. So one of the things that we can do, as I mentioned before, is giving psychoeducation to not only the youth, but also to the parent so that we can help the parent understand that the benefits of use may be medicinally um, are different when looking at youth, and that there may be other routes that they can get the benefits, right? So for instance, asking the youth and or the parent, what are the benefits that you are desiring of the use of marijuana, and then helping them find some more healthy or developmentally appropriate ways to get those needs met may be one way to also deal with that as well. It's called the greenhouse effect. Thank you, Natalie. We have parental and sibling use. So if parents and sibling are using, this creates like a norm within the family and a cultural norm. And so oftentimes we want to do and we kind of mirror and learn the different behaviors of our family members, either consciously or subconsciously, right? So if it's seen as normal and it's nothing that's bad, then they're more likely to engage in the use if they have the opportunity. Additionally, that poor parent-youth relationship. So if they feel like their parent doesn't have time for them, the parents rather be out being with friends, or they rather be at work, or they're always gone, right? If they have poor relationship, or their parents always like coming down on them and doesn't really give them any affirmation or praise or ask them how they're doing, they're only giving direction and only um correcting, right? Unfortunately, a lot of parents fall into the trap of correction, correction, correction because of the demands of adulthood and parenthood, but that can have a negative impact on the youth's self-esteem, on their self-efficacy, and on the relationship they have. And fortunately and unfortunately, the quality of the relationship with their parents is going to set the ground for the relationships with their peers and their romantic partners moving forward into adulthood. And then we have parents who do not graduate from high school, has also been found to be a risk factor correlation as well. And there are a number of different complexities that go into that particular finding. So if it's all right, I'll continue on to the school level, right? So we talked earlier about resilience, one of the main components of resilience being a sense of belonging. So when a youth feels like they belong to their school, right? They are involved in their school and there's a connection to their school, they are less likely to engage in use of marijuana, especially because oftentimes there are school environments have very strict policies around drug use, right? And so the authoritative school environment has also been found to be a deterrent of use as well. And then using approaches around marijuana by policies. So when we are being mindful about how we are penalizing the use of marijuana can also be a protective factor. On the flip side, low risk factors in the school level. If there's a low policy enforcement, right? So maybe sometimes they get in trouble for smoking, or sometimes there is a suspension. Other times there's nothing, right? If there's a low policy enforcement, then there is a higher likelihood of risk factor of the use happening, in addition to out of school suspension. So when we think about, ironically, out of school suspension puts them in another environment where they are more likely or capable of getting access to the drug in the first place. And so that can actually exacerbate the use as opposed to help deter the youth use as it is intended to. And then additionally, we have high truancy, which was something we saw as a correlation in the earlier chapters or earlier slides as well. Right. Okay, guys, one second. I don't know why my, whatever reason, the charger. I'm just gonna hook my computer up real briefly. All right, thank you all for your patience. All right, so let's go on to the next level, right? Our community level. So protective factors, pro-social opportunities, right? So are there opportunities within the neighborhood for the youth to get involved? Can they volunteer at their church, at a soup kitchen? Are there opportunities for them to engage in benevolence and altruism, which are also two characteristics and pieces that have been found to influence resiliency as well? Additionally, are there community norms discouraging youth, right? So as you see, youth are highly impacted by the external environment's perceptions, right? So if the parents, the peers, the school, and the community all look down on that, it's much more likely for them to be deterred from using marijuana or other substances. Now, on the flip side with the risk factors, right? Because there are lots of them here. We have widespread availability of marijuana, right? So is it easy to get marijuana at the corner, or are there lots of dispensaries that are popping up all over the place? Is there a greater marijuana outlet, right? Are there more days and hours of marijuana sales happening within neighborhoods, right? So certain areas have a much easier or not much easier, make it much easier for you to access marijuana, which is also why the marijuana is the most common illicit drug that's used amongst youth, because it's unfortunately, unfortunately, one very accessible and easily grabbed. Like sometimes, depending on the neighborhood, you go to a gas station and see it. Maybe driving up and down neighborhoods on certain blocks, you're able to see it. You might hear people yelling things like loud, or some of those code names that we heard earlier that indicate that, hey, I have that available to you all if you're looking for it. Exposure to marijuana marketing is another piece, and that is why those universal and environmental strategies are really important, because a lot of the marketing is being done that allures the youth and adolescents in, right? Being done like where they're really colorful. The packaging is all very very enticing to youth, or they're doing it through things like pop and candy and cake and things that youth are and that are appealing to youth. When we think about those abstracts and things kind of going in. And then we have the youth liking or following marijuana businesses on social media. So you saw earlier on another slide how there was a sign of use can be the youth actually like being engaged with decor, clothing, etc. that is kind of like more branding around that. And so if you see them on social media kind of following these businesses and things of that nature, looking for marijuana pop-ups and things of that nature, then that may be a risk factor as well, because their perception, right, their attitude, as we see in the individual slide, is that marijuana use is okay. Owning cannabis brand merchandise or having a favorite cannabis brand, as well as new marijuana products attracting youth, right? So this increases the likelihood of them using because of the appeal, because of the perception. And so perception is very, very important, right? So we want to see and understand, how do the youth view the use of marijuana for themselves? How do their peers view it? How do their parents view it? And how does the community view it? How accessible is it within the community, right? These are all some components that we want to consider assessing for when we're engaging with youth. And we'll talk about different ways that we can engage the youth and use some skills to help with the facilitation of gathering this information. Because I'm sure that many of us know when sitting across from adolescents, asking them many questions, oftentimes it's underreported or there's flat out denials. Depending on the youth, there might just be flat lack of engagement whatsoever. And so we'll kind of look at some different ways we can begin engaging youth with different intervention and strategies that are creative and that engage them at the developmental needs that they level that they are at. The piece we're going to check out now are the different strategies and programs specifically that have been found to be effective in the prevention of adolescent marijuana use. Okay, so with community level and environmental interventions, the collaboration of those two levels that we talked about earlier, two strategies, we were looking at regulation of the price of marijuana, regulation of marijuana and retail outlets, regulations around the manufacturing and product packaging, and as well as limitations on the advertising and marketing, right? So are we seeing ads that are popping up along the side and billboards that are saying, hey, the dispensary is here and all those things? So having limitations and policies and regulations within communities and ordinances can help to limit the accessibility, but also help to limit the perception that this is okay, right? So if our community has all these signs that are saying, hey, come to my dispensary, or there are lots of advertising and marketing happening through the music they're listening to, et cetera, this increases their perception that the world, their peers, their community, that marijuana is okay, right? So it's very important that we understand how youth end up overgeneralizing things, right? What they're seeing in their immediate environment, what they're listening to, and what they're hearing are all ways that the perception is influenced, okay? So exploring questions around what type of music are they listening to and whether or not drug use is being promoted in that, right? What are they watching on TV or YouTube, because I barely watch TV now, or Netflix, right? Excuse me. So being mindful of these different things and the exposure of marijuana use that the youth are experiencing is also going to be very heavy. And that is what these community environmental interventions are targeting, right? They're targeting the way in which the marketing and advertising and availability, right? Those community level risk factors we just looked at a moment ago are impacting youth. Some prevention use interventions, and these are going to kind of have some interactions between the indicated, selective, and universal. Most of these are selected and indicated on prevention strategies. So we have teen marijuana checkup, and these are different programs that are looking at targeting different things. Some of them include using the family. Some of them are school-based aspects programs. Other ones of them are looking at different social skills. Some of them are looking at refusal skills. Some of them are looking at all of the above, right? And so there are a number of different ways. Some of them are those indicated so that it's particularly for a particular population that we might be wanting to target it within the group of adolescents. And so these can be found on the SAMHSA reference that is coming up at the end of the slides, where you can kind of go on there and see all of them, and they kind of break down more specifically some details around what these programs are and how they're targeting. And these are all research and evidence-based programs that have been found to be effective in the reducing the initiation of use or the deterrent, right? Turn the use altogether. So again, that's either increasing the age, right? So remembering that the younger they are, the more likely they are to have more frequent use. And so if we could increase the age and when they're using, they're less likely to have some of those more negative outcomes that we mentioned earlier, especially because that gives their brain some time to have developed prior to beginning the use. And we understand that the brain is impacted because of those receptors, the cannabinoid receptors, in addition to those cannabinoid receptors being within some very, very paramount areas and regions of the brain that is developing during adolescence. So let's get into the fun piece, right? How do we engage adolescents? How do we work with them? I absolutely love, love, love adolescents because they challenge you, right? They definitely challenge you and teach you a lot about yourself. And one of the most important things about engaging adolescents is making sure that you are being authentic and genuine in who you are. Your most important intervention is going to be yourself. And so the tool that I want to look at is some motivational interviewing strategies. The motivational interviewing is a substance use intervention or theory that has been used across the board and studied over decades to be found to be helpful in prevention of substance use and helping people whether or not they are seeking treatment or whether or not they are not seeking treatment. And what it does is it helps the individual, motivational interviewing specifically helps the individual to learn more about the to explore their ambivalence or their dissonance, like marijuana I could use because of this, I won't use because of this. It helps them to come to a term around choosing decisions to change based on their value systems, right? Based on what's important to them. Okay. So specifically within adolescence, it helps to create a safe environment for the adolescent to feel vulnerable and for them to feel heard and understood. One of the most common things I hear from teenagers is that it doesn't matter because they don't understand. It won't matter because they're not going to hear me, right? And so feeling heard, feeling understood gives the opportunities for the youth to be able to actually receive the information that we're giving, to interact with the interventions that we'll discuss in a moment and the others that you're using within your programs, right? And so it's very, very important that we're being mindful of how we're showing up when we're engaging the youth, right? Because we don't want to be all stoic and closed off and unapproachable. We are not going to have a very effective interactions with our youth. And so let's look at this motivational interviewing spirit. We're going to look at this because this is an approach and a presence that we can use that gives and eludes acceptance and non-judgmental. And so the four aspects of acceptance is absolute worth, recognizing that this youth sitting across from you, even though they are a child, has absolute worth as an individual and and have capacities and abilities to contribute to their world, their community, their families, and their schools in a great significant way, right? So we're recognizing the significance of this individual being a divine being. And then we have autonomy, right? The autonomy is that we are respecting the fact that they have the right to choose, right? And so the way in which we're engaging and discussing things with the youth, we're not directing them and telling them explicitly, you shouldn't do this and you can't do that, right? Because we'll get lots of pushback and they'll shut down on us oftentimes just out of spite. But it is respecting the autonomy that a person has the right to think how they want to think, act how they want to act, and feel how they want to feel. But within this aspect and within some of the strategies we'll talk about, we're able to help navigate that autonomy in a way where we're promoting it, but we're guiding it in a way that's helping them to make decisions that are going to be best for their long-term goals, especially as it relates to adolescence. And then we're using affirmations, right? And we're going to talk more about these, but we're affirming and recognizing that this individual has strengths, right? That this youth has abilities, capacities, that they've made progress, they've put in efforts, that they have values. We're affirming these things in them. It's a more of a strength-based approach and look at the way in which we're engaging. And then it also has accurate empathy, right? And so what this means is that we are being empathetic, but we're also being empathetic based on what the youth is saying that their concerns are, right? Oftentimes when we sit across from someone, especially a teenager, what is bothering the teenager may not be what we're hearing would be bothersome to us as adults, right? Just because of their life experience and the more egotistical social based view that teenagers have in those moments, okay? So I'm going to take a pause here to come over to the chat box. I see a question or so in here. So someone shared just some context around the lack of education, showing that there's not graduating can kind of influence the parent's ability to have information and understanding around the impact on the harm of drugs. And so there's an increase in the likelihood of the norms of the family members using or not having those explicit rules and those protective factors that we talked about earlier at the family level. Now, Bella has a question which it states, in what ways can we push our government leaders to restrict marketing and branding of marijuana geared toward youth, right? And so there's a number of different ways that can be done. But more specifically, by finding out your municipal government setup that allows you to be able to identify who you go to. Like in Chicago, you would go to your aldermans, right? In other areas, you would go to the mayor. So you need to find out within your community and the town that you're living in, what is the makeup of the governmental structure and who do citizens go to, right? Sometimes there are town hall meetings that you can go to advocate for. You can speak with the mayor, depending on how the setup is in Florida. I'm sorry, I'm not 100% sure of the process. However, that SAMHSA article and the reference that talked about the different programs does give a little bit of information around the way in which Florida has gone about doing some of um, these advocacy around VP. So there's some lobbying that can be done as well. Speaking directly to the candidates who are running for different aspects or different roles within the community and leadership positions in politics can be helpful as well. There are ways to get petitions signed by the community members, by teenagers, by or within the organization that can also get things put onto the ballot at different periods of the process. And so those are just a couple of ways in which we can begin moving towards encouraging the government locally and the municipal government in order to shift some of the way in which things are doing, right? Thinking about zoning, like maybe the zoning may be, if I'm not mistaken, it's one of the things they did is that the zoning may be that it can't be within a certain radius of schools, right? Because then the youth are seeing that and recognizing that and then it's kind of showing exposure to it. So that was a really great question. Yes, yes, yes. And then Delilah, I believe is how we say her name, support conversation candidates who are informed about the dangers of drug use. Yep. So that's another piece as well, where you can kind of go to those candidate forums and ask them questions to get those answers to see if they are informed and how they intend on addressing the needs of the Florida youth. Great questions, guys. I'm going to keep going. So we're going to look at engagement using OARS. And so OARS is an acronym that comes from motivational interviewing as well. Again, motivational interviewing has been found to be helpful over several decades across settings within the field of substance use as well as other ones. And so it especially is helpful because it helps to meet the individual where they are, where oftentimes with the teenagers, they have absolutely no perception of there being anything wrong with using marijuana or there even being harms of marijuana use, right? And so there's a lot of ambivalence that may exist when we're engaging teenagers around marijuana use, rather that be initiation or current use. And so these auras gives us the ability to engage with you so that when we're using different interventions and strategies and offering information, etc., we're able to do so in a way that is landing with the youth, right? Remembering that we are our most important tools and we have to be able to connect with the youth in order to really be able to have an impact on the youth, right? These engagement strategies will also work with parents as well, right? Because these strategies have been shown to work with adults as well. But what's important is understanding within adolescence when we're thinking about how important it is to feel seen, to feel heard and understood, right? These strategies are really, really um, developmentally appropriate for working with teenagers, right? Especially given that they're experiencing and trying to navigate the autonomy and demanding autonomy oftentimes. And so by utilizing these skills that we're going to talk about, we're able to promote some of those natural adolescent developmental tasks that we target when we're thinking about prevention and resilience, as well as to engage them so that we are seeing that we are effective at utilizing additional interventions that are going to help us to get the youth to make different decisions about use or to receive the information we're giving them. So we're going to watch a video in just a short moment, right? Just a short moment, and then we'll kind of talk more about how these specific strategies can be helpful within the context of working with adolescents. And so while that video was being pulled up, I'm going to check the chat box. Okay, so real
Would you
briefly in
like
the
to
chat.
address that before the video?
Yes. So Denise shared a resource with regard to Florida. It says in Florida, there's an advocacy day in Tallahassee each year. In January or February, you can check with FADAA. And then Dion's question, many of the children I work with have parents who use medical marijuana, which is a mixed message. What can I, as a strength-based case manager, say to team? Uh-oh, we have more popping up. It's moving the chat box. I'm sorry, 1 second. Doo-doo-doo. Say to teenagers and their parents that it's not offensive. I usually focus on that this is illegal when you are underage. Follow the law. Other ideas? Yes. So we're going to talk about some specific strategies and we'll think about some different questions. But initially, we first want to find out and explore with curiosity and in a non-judgmental fashion, what are the benefits that we're using the medical marijuana for, right? So are we using it to alleviate anxiety? Are we using it to alleviate pain? What is happening? Why are we using it? And then we can begin to then explore some additional ways in which we can get those needs met in a way that's more developmentally appropriate. A moment ago, we also talked a bit about offering some information. And so one of the ways that we do this within motivational interviewing is a process called elicit, provoke, elicit. And we'll talk about that in a moment, where we are eliciting the thoughts and the reasons why the youth is wanting to use medical marijuana, or the parent is using medical marijuana, why they see it to be beneficial. And then we provide information, right? Can I give you some information that some additional information about the use of it in teenagers, right? And some outcomes. And then you follow up with understanding how that individual is interacting and receiving that information, okay? And so that's one way. The other piece you might want to do is, especially if you work with the family or the youth, elicit an understanding of what their values are, what their goals are, right? And within that, you're able to kind of either formulate some questions to get the youth thinking critically around how their use is going to impact those goals and those and how it aligns with those values, and or you're able to then explicitly state how the values and the abstinence or deterrence aligns with the values and or goals. Make sense? Okay. All right. And then Bella gave, thanks, Angel, for your kind words. Bella gave a suggestion to explain to the child the difference between medical and recreational marijuana. Then she spoke to the explanation around potency of medical marijuana is much less than recreational. Yeah, so we're kind of like being able to help them discern the difference was okay. So she is saying more on the point we talked about a little moment ago. Piece here also is that you can educate the child on the effects of using marijuana and how it affects the brain on youth. Also having the child come up with negative effects of using recreational marijuana, right? Especially, and so just a little nuance there, when you are doing so, ask questions that relates directly to what's important to them and directly to their goals, right? How would this impact your goal to join the football team, right? How does it impact the ability to get a scholarship, full ride scholarship? What happens if the team is dropped, right? How can it impact your lungs? So being able to kind of ask these questions can also be helpful as well, and getting the youth to kind of begin thinking for themselves, right? Because one of the developmental tasks of adolescence is problem solving. And so when we ask really thoughtful questions, kind of going into this next slide, but when we ask really thoughtful questions, we're able to see and discover a number of things. And I'm going to pause on what those things are just so that we can see the video, which is going to introduce the different components of ORs, and then we'll walk through more specifically as it relates to adolescent development, how it can be helpful in navigating the deterrence and promoting resilience with them.
Let's start by learning an acronym that we use to describe these very concrete, engaging skills. ORs. So what does the acronym ORs represent? ORs stands for open-ended questions, affirmations, reflections, and summaries. These are the basic engaging skills in motivational interviewing. O stands for open-ended questions, and we contrast open-ended questions with closed questions. Closed questions, the answer is yes or no. Open questions have the value of helping clients to explore their own thoughts, experiences, and feelings in greater detail. A stands for affirmation. An affirmation is really nothing more than you noticing something positive about your client and bringing that forward in an explicit fashion. R stands for reflection. Here we're talking about reflective listening or active listening. You're offering a guess about what the client has had to say to you, but you're offering that guess as a statement and not a question. S stands for summary. And summary is really nothing more than you taking an opportunity in the course of your conversation with your client to let them know that you've been following, you've been listening, you've been tracking, by offering them a brief summary of what they've had to say to you so far.
Okay, so she gave review. We're going to look a little bit deeper into how each one of these particular pieces of the acronym will be helpful in engaging adolescents, right? And so as adults, when we're engaging with the adolescents, asking open-ended questions helps us to guide the adolescents process in identifying the situation or options and consequences, right? So for instance, we talked about like some questions around impact, right? So I'm going to throw out to the group here, what are some other ways we might, or other type of open-ended questions we might ask in order to explore things with the youth? And you might want to use your chat box there. These open-ended questions also allow for us not to give the advice, right? And not to try to tell the youth what to do, which is oftentimes like the opposite of what we want to do with teenagers, okay? Especially when we think about their developmental task of agency and autonomy, right? I wonder what that looks like. So here's some questions. That was very good video to use my job. What do you like about smoking marijuana? Yes, yes, yes. Great question. Keep them coming, right? So these open-ended questions are also going to help you understand what's important to the youth, right? What their goals are, what their values are, and their line of thinking. So that as you're navigating with them, you're able to address any concerns or myths or misinformation that they might have. Okay. Some additional questions we have here are: what do you think about your friends using marijuana, right? When we think about the protective and risk factors of the perception, that's a great question. We have what do you know about the effects of marijuana? A great question to use to elicit some information so that you are not giving redundant information, and you can give information that is corrective and or complementary to what it is that the youth already know. And then it also gets them to articulate and start thinking about what it is that they do know, especially if it's something around consequences, etc. Right? And then we have here, what do you think would happen if you didn't use marijuana? Which is a really great way of using motivational interviewing question, open-ended question, where we are helping them to explore what are the benefits of not using, right? Without saying, why wouldn't you use, right? Or you shouldn't use. So we're getting them again to articulate for themselves what are their personal reasons for or against a particular thing. All right, it says, what do you, okay, perfect. So let's see here. Okay. All right, do your friends use marijuana? How does marijuana make you feel? How do you feel about marijuana? Yes, great questions, everyone. So these open-ended questions, again, are so helpful in exploring values and being able to help guide the youth in a developmental task of problem solving and consideration of different things, right? It's also helpful in the youth, in the adult, understanding the line of thinking that the youth is taking, right? Because oftentimes they're thinking a lot more than we give them credit for, and they're youth, and oftentimes they're also considering the things that their parents have said more often than we anticipate or assume that they are. And, and then again, it also gives the opportunity for the youth to speak their mind, right? So we're demonstrating that I care about your perspective. I care about what you think, which is often, I'm telling you, like one of the number one things teenagers say. And I'm sure those of us working with teenagers can attest. Almost every teenager says something to the effects of it not the adults not understanding them or caring, right? Or listening, or not mattering if they were to speak up and try to communicate what their concerns are, etc. Okay. So open-ended questions are very helpful for not only the developmental task, but also in the process of helping to explore the ambivalence around use in the first place. Because what we do know is that most people who go to treatment for marijuana do not seek it themselves. And especially when we think about teenagers, they are oftentimes there because of a mandate from court, from their family, or from their school. Okay, so that they talked about reflection, affirmation, and summaries as well. These three different things help the adolescent to know that they are heard and understood, right? Because if the adolescent feels heard and understood and respected, they are more likely to be forthcoming with you, but then also receive the information that you're giving to them, because they don't perceive that you're judging them, or that you think that they're a bad child or teenager or things of that nature. And so these reflection pieces, you want to reflect their intentions. You want to reflect their progress, their values. You want to reflect their emotions. You want to reflect their concerns, right? So you want to reflect the things that you hear them saying underneath some, especially as well as some of the things that are being implied, right? They might be expressing that they feel angry, but not using the word angry or the emotion. So also labeling the emotion within the reflection can be very helpful in adolescence, because one of the major developmental tasks is to be able to regulate and have emotional literacy. So if I do not know that this emotion that I'm experiencing is called rage or disappointment, then it is very difficult for them to be able to appropriately express that, right? So when we're reflecting, being able to reflect, it sounds like that made you really angry, might be helpful. Not to mention, reflections oftentimes lead the youth to start to expound on what it is that was being said, right? Affirmations, we want to affirm, like similar to what we're reflecting, but we want to affirm their efforts, their progress, their intentions, their values, their strengths, right? We want to affirm as much as we can about that individual. But again, this has to be done in a very genuine way, right? A way that is empathetic and non-judgmental, right? Because we don't want to just say, oh, well, you know, you're good at dressing, but we don't really believe it, right? Teenagers are very, very attuned to people being authentic, very hyper vigilant about social status and things. Okay, let me just, and then so then your summaries, one of the things about the summaries that's really important is that you are it's like a rainbow of reflections, right? Or a bouquet, if you will, of reflections. But essentially, this is showing, and this is especially important when you're trying to give counter advice, right? So when we think about the suggestion or the question that's come up a couple of times now around the parent using marijuana or promoting the use of marijuana, right? We want to summarize the importance and what their perspectives are, their intentions are, exactly their values are, so that they feel understood before we give them any information that's saying, no, you shouldn't use, right? Or that might be indicating that they may want to consider or reconsider using, right? We're much more likely to receive evidence that is counter to our beliefs or evidence that is counter to our desires if we feel understood, right? As opposed to feeling judged, right? Especially as a parent. So is this professional sitting across from me telling me that I don't know what's best for my child, or telling me that I'm a bad parent, and all of these different things that can come and unfold just due to the sensitive nature of parenting in general, right? And so Bella, I dropped in a statement that you can use to help out with reflections. What I hear you say is that, right? Which is one way to indicate that you are reflecting things back, or you might just say it. And with summaries, more specifically, you also want to indicate that you're summarizing, right? So that's a really great way to start a summarization, right? What I heard, what I hear, it sounds like, right? Those are a couple of different ways that you can begin to unfold that you are going into a reflection. Now, other piece that's important is to understand that reflections and summaries also provide an opportunity for clarification or correction, right? So be okay with you saying, no, 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 that's not how I meant it, right? Etc. And so with that, again, that's also demonstrating and helping the youth to build their communication skills, their autonomy skills, their self-confidence skills, right? Because I'm challenging an adult at this point. I'm speaking up when there's a misperception. So we're also in that process of engaging with the youth, also promoting resilience through healthy relationships. We're also promoting resilience through them practicing communication, etc. Okay. Do we have any questions about the ORs or why we want to use them with the youth? So open-ended questions. We talked about elicit, provoke, elicit technique. Right. And so with this particular technique, you as the adult are going to ask the youth their thoughts about something, right? So we talked about earlier about asking the youth, what are your thoughts about marijuana, right? Or why do you think medical marijuana is helpful, right? And then following that information, you then give information that is additions, right? And I encourage you to ask permission to do so. Can I share some more information with you, right? Would you like to know more? Asking permission can be, again, helpful in that joining and engaging and opening up the door for them to receive it, right? So they don't feel like we're just like throwing things at them. And then after you give that information around the potential outcomes or consequences of drugs, et cetera, and the use of marijuana, you're then able to respectfully ask them, what do they think about that, right? So we're respecting their autonomy, we're acknowledging that they have some information and current knowledge, and we're also then going to be able to have a platform for us to deliver information. Because I just modeled to you what it looks like to respect what someone's saying. So now you can do the same for me and hear what I'm saying to you. And then I'm going to ask you what your thoughts are because I respect your autonomy, right? Back to that MI spirit and those aspects around autonomy, and back to the importance of autonomy being developed for adolescents, right? This is a very, very important piece in adolescence, that self-efficacy, the autonomy. And then also values are important components, right? In the guidance of decision making. And so when you're hearing and reflecting what's being said, you can ask open-ended questions that are alluded to how there might be a mismatch between the value and the action of using marijuana, right? Or the goal and the action of using marijuana. So that is what open-ended questions might look like for our youth and within the process of the youth. And so now I would like to go into some more concrete, fun activities that you might be able to use and engage in with the youth around building and targeting those areas that we know are significant to development of adolescents, but also that are going to be paramount to the resilience within adolescents, okay? So the self-esteem and self-efficacy, one of those important developmental tasks that our youth are learning, not only to have a positive view of themselves, but also to have belief in themselves for their capacities and abilities to do or accomplish things, right? Namely, here we're talking about the ability to deter from use of or initiation of the use in marijuana. So one thing we might do for a self-esteem activity is have an image of a mirror, which is basically like an outline. You can Google like mirror image or mirror reflection, right? So you can kind of print that out and give it to the youth, or you can put it up visually depending on if you're virtual or in person. And there's a number of different ways that you can engage the youth here. You can prompt them with something like create the how you view yourself. Tell me how you view yourself. Draw how you view yourself. How do you want to view yourself, right? How do you want to look? How do you want to be seen, right? You can give several different prompts that are helping the youth to explore their current image as well as beginning to unfold how they desire to look. And then in that process of that art activity, you are able to then begin having some more in-depth conversations around help guiding to that and challenging any misperceptions, etc. Another way that you can use this mirror image is to kind of have them make a collage of the way that they see themselves or would like to see themselves, or the things that they appreciate about themselves, the values that they have, right? It can create like a little word reflection there, or image reflection. So that's one particular way that you can engage them. Another is called the value sort. This is from the motivational interviewing theory, and you can find these cards online. I can share them too, so you don't have to go searching for them in addition to the videos on the brain use. I'm just writing that down. But the value sort is a really fun interactive activity that the youth can use, which is going to help them build their self-esteem and their self-efficacy, because when they know what's important to them, they are able to use that as a compass in different social situations. Okay. And so what this looks like is there are about, oh gosh, almost 200 different values. There's a word and the definition of the value. The youth are going to take these cards and manipulate them into 3 different columns. The first column is going to be what's very important to them. The second, what's important, and that third, what's not important. And they get to manipulate. Yes, Susan can attest to the effectiveness of this activity, and they're able to manipulate what's important, what's not important, right? So you give them a moment to kind of do that and manipulate that, maybe like 10, 15 at a time. You pause. So there's so many of them that you'll likely go through this several times, but then you have a discussion about that process. Like, how did you choose what was important to you? Why was that important to you? Did anything surprise you? Was it hard to identify these things, right? Yes, you can definitely do this activity with adults. I do it all the time. Motivational interviewing works with both adults and youth, and you can do that mirror image with adults as well. What's really cool is like before starting to work with adults, I work primarily with children and adolescents, and and I've been able to adapt almost all of the activities with adults, and they love them and engage with them very, very well. We talked about extracurricular activities and how those are protective factors and why. So we're encouraging them to get involved with those, sharing different resources, helping them identify what they're interested in is going to be very, very helpful. Affirming their characteristics, their values, and their efforts, right? We talked about affirmations, but I cannot hammer home how important it is for the youth to receive this feedback from a caring adult, an adult that they feel connected to, right? And the literature shows so like overwhelming support around the importance of a healthy relationship with a caring adult when it comes to resilience. And so affirming and acknowledging them, seeing them is so, so important. It can go so far. And then we have role playing, right? So with this specifically, you might have a scenario with the youth where maybe there's a drug being offered or there's a challenging such scenario that they're being engaged in, and you have them practice some of these refusal skills or saying no or their exit strategy that we'll talk about in just a moment, right? This can be helpful in helping them to build confidence in their ability to say no and refuse or deter or not, or practice abstinence, right? And another thing that's important with this is it also creates neural pathways in the brain. So when they begin to engage in this behavior in that practice with you, they now have a neural pathway in their brain where they've done this before, and it makes it a little bit easier for it to be acted on in the present moment. And you're able to kind of walk through any challenges or discomforts that they might have and process those things so that they're more successful in the actual, social setting and scenario with their peers. The next is communication and relationships. We want to target this area because, as you saw earlier with the risk and protective factors, communication and relationships are so significant, right? The peer influence, the family influence, the community influence. So we want to really build those skills. So assertive communication, when we're teaching them how to use I statements, right? And so one way that I've done this with youth before in the prevention or treatment of substance use is kind of giving a socially appropriate scenario, right? An example around a you statement versus I statement. So I would typically tell them, like a you statement, like, you're all, wait, you better not say my name anymore versus I don't want you saying my name. It lands differently, right? And kind of talking about the difference between when I start with you versus I start with I. So kind of getting them to begin thinking about what that looks like. And then introducing to them the different types of communication: aggressive, passive aggressive, assertive, and passive, and talking about different ways that can show up. So you might give them a scenario and have them create a statement for each one, or you might, give them a video, have them watch a video around the different ways in which assertive communication, or I'm sorry, that explains the different types, right? I've used worksheets before, I've used videos, and then you introduce I statements. I statements have three components. It's an assertive way to express the need and the impact, okay? And so the first part of the sentence is how the individual or the youth is being impacted. So I feel, I believe, I am, right? So I'm offended. Second part is what's the behavior that we're specifically addressing. So maybe, for instance, the youth is saying that they are struggling with their mom's negative feedback all the time, right? And it makes them feel overwhelmed, and that's the reason why they're using. But it's just too much because they're always breathing down their neck, right? So an I statement we might have them do, with that third part being the request, is I feel really bummed out when you make those comments about me, mom. Can you please stop? Right. Yeah. Right. But it's three parts. It's what is I, and how I'm impacted by what behavior, what is my request or my need. So it also helps them to set boundaries. It helps them to express themselves when there is a conflict. It also helps them to express disagreeing opinions, right? So that's one way to help teach I statements to youth, through the videos, activities, role plays. We want to also teach them conflict management styles. Again, you can use handouts, worksheets, videos, role plays in order to kind of engage and play around with different ones like that. A still face activity is a fun activity that many people may have had interactions with before, but essentially it's just teaching them how important it is to be active and engaging, right? Especially when we think about how children are always looking down at their phones, or just the world nowadays, but especially teenagers, right? And so being able to recognize how a person is impacted when a person, the listener, is how the speaker is impacted when the listener is not listening or present, right? And so one, you might have them have a conversation about something fun you did, something really benign, right? Nothing vulnerable, something fun. Have them have that conversation. The first prompt is for the listener to just look at them with a blank face and say nothing, okay? Or just look down at their phone. Okay. And then afterwards, have them discuss, how did the speaker feel? And then usually you can have a third person observe and talk about what they observed within their action, right? The second part is for them to now have a conversation. You can use the same fun prompt or a different one, and have them, the listener, now engage and respond to what they're hearing them say, right? So you're going to teach them some active listening, reflective listening, maybe have some dialogue before starting the activity around what makes you feel heard or understood, who's an important person in your life, why do they make you feel understood, right? So you can kind of get them to begin thinking about the verbal and nonverbal communication and all those things before doing this activity. So those are three activities. The next one is called the broken record technique, which is a particular activity or strategy that can be used in the refusal skills, right? One of the things that prevention of substance use, marijuana use, is help making sure that the youth have refusal skills. So a broken record technique is repeating the no, right? And so you will help them identify maybe an I statement and how they're going to continue saying it. You might role play them using it over and over and over again. You might even have them kind of, if they're like really creative, visualize themselves doing it or draw themselves having this interaction, right? Within a tool, within a social setting, or if they're writers, or if they write music. Like, there are so many different ways that you can engage them, right? You can adapt it into activities, use videos, use music, songs, etc. And then exit plan strategy is always a really great one. What is a way that you can exit stage left and not have to necessarily say no, right? So for instance, you know what? I just forgot I'm supposed to babysit my sister. My mom's going to kill me. I have to go. right? And so kind of helping them come up with a socially acceptable excuse as to why they can't use, so that they don't feel so vulnerable by saying, no, I don't want to use, right? And so that is another way that we can prepare youth to be able to communicate and navigate situations that involve the pressure of using. The next is to look at family engagement. We talked earlier about how significant the family environment is to the youth's protective and risk factors or their initiation of use. And so what we want to do is make sure that we are increasing the possibility for family members, parents, and youth to engage with each other in enjoyable moments. Oftentimes, unfortunately, especially in 2023, there's just so much go, 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 so much strain around finances, inflation, etc., that sometimes families kind of get lost in just the flow of things, where we're just only doing what we have to do. I'm cooking dinner, I'm redirecting you, I'm guiding you, did you do your homework? But there's not really much engagement, right? And so, for instance, one things you might do within a therapy room or as an organization, you might like host a particular night. You might use like a family game night where maybe you have a whole bunch of board games, or you have like one of those fun games. I'm trying to think, just like some game you can use with your phone. That's pretty cool. So you can use opportunities for different families to have just like different activities together. Have strength-based guided discussions. Heads up, thank you. They have like this phone piece that you can use now. A family art night, a family karaoke night, a family movie night. So a way for them to just have natural, healthy interactions, to just enjoy each other, right? If you remember, one of the protective factors is a healthy relationship, whereas a risk factor is not having a good relationship with their parents. And so when we begin to create this, it allows us to be able to have the family begin to unfold. Another strategy I oftentimes use with parents and youth, because you have to engage parents in treatment with teenagers and children, right? At least I believe that's the most responsible use way to do so, especially when we understand how important they are to the risk and protect them and their resiliency. And so one thing you can do is have the parent and child answer questions with each other, strength-based questions, right? So for instance, you might have 3 or 4 questions, like my favorite memory with my mom versus my favorite memory with my child, right? What's something my mom appreciates about me? What's something I appreciate about my mom? And then the child and the parent begin to and try to answer and see if they were able to answer the question appropriately. For you as a clinician, that will give you an understanding of the attunement that they have in the relational dynamics, but it also guides a strength-based discussion, so that even if there aren't these opportunities where they're enjoying each other and it's a close relationship, the child may be able to hear for the first time what their parent appreciates, and vice versa for the parent, right? That's another particular way that you can kind of help. But you also want to make sure that you're encouraging parents to have discussions with their teens, specifically around their expectations of use, the rules around use of marijuana, as well as the other drugs that are out there, alcohol, etc., and encouraging parents to affirm their teens, their strengths, their efforts, their values, their interests, their talents, right? Because hearing those things from their parents is going to impact their self-esteem and their self-efficacy, right? So we're able to use the parents and essentially empower the parents so that they are able to begin having these discussions with their children, so we can amplify those protective factors that we identified earlier today. And then we have mindfulness and coping, right? Because this is so important, because emotional literacy, coping skills, dealing with big emotions in connection with problem solving and executive functioning is another core component of adolescence. And so when we think about teaching them mindfulness and coping skills, I have just a small few exercises you can do, but there are some things you can kind of do where you can actually walk them through these activities. So one is called progressive muscle relaxation. Because of time, I won't walk us through. I was going to pick one and walk us through, but I want to make sure that we have time to answer any questions. So the progressive muscle relaxation is essentially a exercise that can be really helpful for anxiety. It can be helpful for PTSD. It can be helpful for insomnia, right? We saw well, later on we'll see some withdrawal symptoms and things like that that kind of come up around trouble with sleeping and irritability and things of that nature. Or even when we think about some of the risk factors or around aggression, right? This can all, and sensation seeking and anger, this can be helpful in managing some of those things as well. Box breathing is a grounding breath, whereas the progressive muscle relaxation is a calming type of exercise that engages the muscles and releases them. Box breathing is a count that inhales for 4 seconds, hold for 4 seconds, exhale for 4 seconds, hold for 4 seconds. It can be moved for like 4 seconds, 6 seconds, 3 seconds, it can be modified. But essentially, you are holding, inhaling, holding, exhaling, holding for the same count. Okay, that's called box breathing. You can YouTube these videos and find a number of different ways. And there's also a lot of different mindfulness apps as well that can walk the youth through these too, or scripts online that you can use if you feel comfortable with it. And then we have a coping box. So this might look like helping the youth to create like a box that has different things that they can use in there to cope with, right? So maybe it's a list of all their favorite songs that bring them joy. Maybe it's a fidget in there. Perhaps it's a picture of their favorite person, right? So different things that contribute to wellness and self-care, right? Maybe it's some smell good lotion just for like grounding purposes, right? It could also be some more sensory based stuff, especially for people who are more tactile and things of that nature that can be done. So the youth can design the box, and kind of get real creative with that. So if you have a lot of different not extras, activities that can be really cool, and kind of seeing how those boxes or containers are designed. You can use 10 box, you can use a box, 10, tens, almost any container can be used for this. And then we have exercise and movement, right? Which is perfect for what Susan's dropping in here about a youth summit in 2 weeks, where they'll have mindfulness, coping skills, new yoga, Zumba, breathing exercises, right? These are all tapping into the ventral vagal nerve, which is helping the youth to calm down and regulate, which is also going to help with that executive functioning that the youth are practicing and developing in this state, right? So the exercise may look like actual games that you have them play together, cooperative games, sports and things. It could be dance, Zumba, right? You can do like a nowadays you can YouTube something like Just Dance and kind of do that together in your therapy room, and doing so helps with impulse control as well, right? Because now I have to intentionally move my body. So there are many ways that we can help them learn skills in a way that's not talk therapy, or just purely talk therapy, or in a way that is experientially practicing the skills that we are teaching them and hoping to influence with them. Okay. All right. So we have here some resources, a brochure for parents about marijuana, there's some different talking points and psychoeducational points that they can use with their parents, especially when we think about how important the parents' perspective, those explicit rules are in being a protective factor and in promoting resilience. And then we have the strategic prevention framework guide. So this kind of helps you in selecting, implementing, and evaluating different prevention interventions across the universal, indicated, and selective options that we have. And then we have a think cultural health guide, which is helping to implement it within a cultural competency, right? And understanding that there's adaptations not only to the developmental task of adolescents, but also to the different communities that we might find ourselves working with that have different values outside of the mainstream. Okay. Any questions about the resilience, the protective factors, and how we're navigating that before we look at what treatment looks like for our youth? Okay. Anything for parents to talk with elementary age children. I'm sure that there is something on SAMHSA for sure. There would definitely be, SAMHSA would be a good resource to be able to find different parental tools. And then NIDH, the National Institute for Drug Abuse and Health, also has some really great resources for parents and tools as well. For the question was working with elementary or younger children, some different pieces. But also some of these points are also important to help elementary children know about as well. But usually when we're dealing with younger children, we're doing more around like refusal skills and kind of thinking like about the dare or preventative aspect of things. So with marijuana use treatment, as I mentioned earlier, it's very rare for people who have or are abusing marijuana to seek treatment. And adolescents particularly, it's very rare, and are usually doing so due to a family member or a mandate. So the parent has decided, I'm smelling all the time. They're always high. That's impacting them. They have concerns. The school is mandating it or something to that effect. And so the primary treatment approaches that have been found to be effective in substance use with teenagers is supportive therapy and family system approaches, remembering how important and how significant parents and family relationships and dynamics are to the risk and protective factors around promotion of that resilience. So if we're able to cultivate a strong, healthy dynamic with the parents within the family, then we are more likely to see the resilience for that youth as they navigate life's circumstances. Then we have motivational enhancement therapy, which we talked a little bit, which we'll briefly look over, but it's essentially an adaptation of the motivational interviewing format where it's short in duration, I think like 1 or 4 sessions, and it goes a little faster. But again, if the focus is to help the youth recognize and explore the reasons why they might want to change their behavior and the reasons why abstinence or deterrence was going to be, or in this case, abstinence may be, or harm reduction, depending on the model, may be the best way for them to go. And then you have contingency management, which is typically used in conjunction with those aforementioned strategies, but essentially it is where there is a reinforcement or some type of reward or incentive that happens after a desired behavior. And especially when we think about the delayed gratification versus immediate gratification, and how youth especially are so vulnerable to that immediate gratification, and how dopamine can be really great, having contingency management programs can be helpful. So with the marijuana use disorder, what does this look like, right? So there's going to be 2 or more of the following within a 12-month period. So what's important as we go through these, we want to be mindful about how we can create open-ended questions to ask the questions to assess this, right? When we ask it in a closed-ended way, do you use marijuana, yes or no? We may find ourselves getting what's called a reporter bias, where we're not getting accurate information about what's happening, right? So we want to know if they're using marijuana more than intended. So you might ask a question like, can you tell me a time where it took longer than expected to get high, right? Failing to cut down or control the use despite wanting to do so, right? When have you tried stopping, right? What happened? How successful have you been at stopping? Right? Open-ended questions that get them to elaborate on if they decided to stop, if they've tried, and rather they even think they need to, right? Spending excessive amounts of time and activities surrounding marijuana use, right? So this might be where they're waiting forever for someone to bring them the marijuana, or maybe it's they're like waiting forever to get some money so then they can go and get the marijuana. So it's like 2, 3, 4, 5 hours have passed by where they're focused on the task of getting high, right? um, Experiencing urges and cravings for marijuana, right? So when do you have a craving for marijuana? When do you want to use marijuana most, right? Sometimes the word urges or cravings can be triggering for them. So utilizing language that's relevant to the youth is going to be very important. Failing to meet the obligations at home, school, or work. So tell me about a time that smoking weed stopped you from getting things done at home, or stopped you from getting things done at school or at work, right? Or how has being high impacted your home life, your school life, your work life, okay? Continuing to use marijuana, even if it's led to a relationship or social problem. So maybe it's causing a lot of conflict with the parents, where the parents losing trust in them, and parents no longer really engaging with them in positive ways because of all of the challenges that are coming up. Nonetheless, the youth might continue to use the marijuana in spite of the negative impact it's having on the family. And we have giving up or reducing important recreational, school, or work-related activities because of marijuana use, right? So maybe they choose to go smoke weed at their friend's house instead of going to football practice. Right. And so we want to think creative around how can we ask questions that help us to understand more around. And so there are a couple of more things that might happen. Using marijuana in situations where it's physically hazardous, right? So, understanding if they're using it and while they're driving, if they're using it hanging out off around the expressway, if they're running across the street and doing risky things because of their being high, right? These are some things that we want to explore. We also have continuing to use marijuana even if there is an awareness that is causing or worsening a physical or psychological problem. So we saw earlier that marijuana use is associated with depression and psychosis, right? As well as respiratory challenges. And so let's say, for instance, this youth has asthma and is causing asthma attacks, right? It's activating their asthma, and they're finding themselves in the ER, and still they're wanting to smoke, right? Experiencing an increase in the tolerance for marijuana. So maybe they began smoking once every couple of weeks, but now they are smoking multiple times a day, and they're smoking multiple bowls or cigars a day. So then having withdrawal symptoms when not taken. And so we'll talk a little bit about withdrawal symptoms in a moment, but typically that 1 to 3 day period is when you see most of those withdrawal symptoms occurring as well. And so with that, you want to have some specific questions as asking them about those particular withdrawal symptoms, because naturally they don't know, right? So tell me when you've experienced irritability, how often do you experience a loss of appetite, etc. Now, depending on how many of these things that you're able to check off with the youth, it will determine the severity of their marijuana use disorder And from there, you're able to begin targeting different things. Remembering that when we're dealing with adolescents, we're working with complexities, right? So we need to engage the family or parent, as well as, if possible, the teachers in school, if that's available to you all. So getting releases of information can be helpful to be able to make sure that the system is working together to support the youth, and that also to help all the adults involved in the youth world to understand why the youth is showing up the way they're showing up, because oftentimes there's a lot of behavior problems that may be associated with use in adolescence as well. And so this is what the use looks like for marijuana, remembering that the frequency of use for adolescents is much more indicative of the substance use than the duration of use, right? For when we're thinking specifically about our adolescent youth. What do these withdrawal symptoms look like? 50 to 95% of people report withdrawal symptoms. It usually occurs within 1 or 3 days of abstinence, with day 2 and 6 being the highest peak. It's usually lasts anywhere between 4 to 14 days in duration, and the severity of the disorder increases the chances of relapse, especially during those first 3 days. Some withdrawal symptoms look like difficulties getting to sleep or staying asleep, anxiety, irritability, physical tenseness, low mood, reduced appetite, nightmares, and strange dreams. And so when you're dealing with adolescents and maybe they choose to practice abstinence, we want to help them understand what the withdrawal symptoms might look like ahead of time and have some game strategies to help manage some of those things, right? How to sublimate their use and the reason for the use. I'm going to pause and just check the chat box real quick. It says that I'm working with a high school student who is dealing with grief, and her way out is using weed as an escape along with alcohol. Do you have any good resources to help her cope with those substance use? She's drinking a lot. Okay, so like resources as in like interventions that you like to use with her, Celia. I'm sorry if I'm mispronouncing your name. Okay. Yes. So you want to give her psychoeducation around grief. So you're kind of going to want to work with both of those things alongside each other, right? So helping the family's not aware of her substance use. Okay. So helping to build those social emotional literacy skills is going to be really helpful, because what's happening is the issue is her inability or her challenge with coping, right? And so if we're able to give her psychoeducation around grief, helping her to remain connected to her loved one, working through any beliefs or challenges that are coming up around the grief, when we resolve the core issue, it also typically has a direct impact on the use as well. And then you're also going to want to help them understand what are the precipitators or the antecedents to using, right? So when you feel sad, when you feel angry, maybe when you have a reminder of your lost loved one, helping her understand like what antecedents are happening, so that there's a game plan about how we're going to use with those pieces. Oh, wow. Said her mother passed away from drinking problems as well, so it's been a family history. Okay, so we saw genetics being one of those risk factors, right? And so with that, that might be where we want to use some open-ended questions very strategically because of the grief that she's dealing with, but just understanding, well, how did drinking impact your mom, right? How has drinking impacted your family? What would happen if you didn't drink? What would happen if you kept drinking, right? Kind of understanding. Can I give you some information about how family history impacts alcoholism, right? Or substance use. So I would definitely use some elicit, provoke, elicit, definitely use those engagement skills and being creative in how you can help her deal with emotional literacy, regulation, and regulating that grief, right? In addition to supplementing that behavior. Hope that was helpful. All right. Okay, so with motivational interviewing enhancement therapy, the MET, which was one that we talked about earlier, I've already kind of explained that the goal is to help reduce the ambivalence around changing the behavior to increase their likelihood for change. And so one thing you might do is actually teach them about the stages of change, right? The pre-contemplation, contemplation. What I've done in the past is kind of like drew out a road using a visual and then put the stages at different places, gave it to the youth, and then asked them, where do they see themselves at? Right. Again, where do you see yourselves as kind of open-ended as opposed to are you on any one of these, right? Or are you using type of thing? We want to understand that empathy and non-judgmental interactions, open-ended questions, and that validation and affirmation is a key component to motivational enhancement. And these particular model is 1 to 4 sessions for those of us who are dealing with short-term processes or restrictions within the organizations. Cognitive behavioral therapy, CBT. What we want to do here is alter the learned behavior so that we are not only able to recognize the antecedent or situations that trigger the thought or emotion that causes the behavior of use, right? But then also challenging those unhelpful thoughts and cognitions or beliefs that are contributing, and learning different ways to cope with these strong emotions as well as to address and respond to those thoughts. And then contingency management, which we talked about earlier, is usually used in conjunction, and it is based on the idea of positive reinforcement, or the idea that if it's reinforced, the behavior will increase. So we want to understand that supportive factors of harm reduction includes distress tolerance, right? So the ability to recognize and tolerate having strong emotions of disappointment, of anger, of sadness, etc., right? Use of active coping skills. So not only am I able to tolerate these emotions, but I'm able to recognize that I'm feeling it so that I can actually cope with it. So am I going to go listen to music, maybe go play a game, maybe talk to my best friend? And then stimulus removal or distraction, right? So kind of thinking about that CBT sort of thing and what the antecedents are. So what environments do I need to avoid? What type of people do I need to avoid? How am I going to distract myself from certain emotions or thoughts that pull me towards the desire to use, right? So those are some pieces that are going to be supportive in helping with that harm reduction or abstinence goal. And then our barriers is exposure to cannabis users, right? Because being around it begins to trigger those neural pathways and the desire to use. Increased severity. So when we have more symptoms on those criteria, it's going to make it a little harder to stop using, especially within those first 3 days when the withdrawal symptoms are the highest. Not seeking treatment, having high stress and depression, right? So having overwhelm where the use is functional, right? Because using the marijuana is somehow helping with the stress management and depression symptoms, then that may be a barrier, in addition to less education, right? Because of the complexities of all of those different levels, the family, the community, the state or country at large, right? So these things are going to be some pieces that are important for us to be mindful of in the process of working with them. So that is the end of the presentation. I hope that you are walking away with some concrete ways that you're able to begin working with youth and promoting resilience, and able to recognize the risk and protective factors when you see them, but most importantly, focus on those strengths so that you can promote resilience and prevent their use. Thank you all for your contributions and commitments to the youth and their families. I'm going to turn it back over.
Thank you so much, Ms. Sell. I really appreciate the presentation. Seems like we're already getting some good comments in the chat box. So thank you so much for your time today. Ladies and gentlemen, if you would hold for us for just a moment while we cover some quick business items before we conclude. I want to say first again, thank you, Ms. Sell, for that great presentation. We have included her contact information here on the screen. If you would like to reach out to her with any questions about today's presentation, you're more than welcome to do so. Additionally, I will post the survey in the chat box for your convenience here. So that is their now evaluation link in the chat box. When you go to take the evaluation, you will be prompted to sign in or register to complete the evaluation. You can register as a visitor at no cost. For CEs to be reported to CE broker for Florida licensed healthcare practitioners, please remember to provide an accurate Florida Department of Health license prefix and number the first time you register. After you register or sign in, you will be directed to complete the evaluation. You must use the same email address you used when you registered for today's webinar and when you set up your profile in FATA system. This is the only way for us to connect your attendance and your profile. You will get a second opportunity to complete the evaluation through a follow-up email here in a few moments. The evaluation will close at the end of the day on October 3rd, 2023. If you experience difficulty logging into your account or accessing the survey, please contact FATA's team either by filling out a contact form on our website as shown on the screen, or by sending an email to training@floridabha.org before the evaluation closes. We do not email statements of credit. Instead, after we verify your attendance and completion of the evaluation, a statement of credit will be generated as a journal entry within your profile 30 business days after the evaluation closes. As a reminder, the recording and materials used in today's presentation will be available on the FATA website within 30 business days. To access the recording and the PowerPoint, visit www.fata.org, navigate to the Resource Center, and click on Training Library as shown on the screen. Thank you for participating in today's webinar. We'd like to thank Mrs. L again, and we'd also like to recognize and thank the Florida Department of Children and Families for funding today's education. Have a great day, and please hold for the evaluation.